This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, with Panel 2 of the RCMI's April 27th conference on threat and preparedness. Panel 2 focused on the theme, Reviewing Our Defenses.
Thank you, Chris. Delighted and honored to chair this very distinguished panel, which I see is really a continuation on of the previous panel, which got us directly into the concerns we're facing today and what we're going to do about them. The last panel, we had the role of CSIS, ably described by Andy. We had the lesson that never forget your history from John, and we had a very effective lecture about complacency from Alan. We're going to continue on that theme, dealing with preparations to prevent, mitigate, and recover from natural, human, and technological disruption. Are they adequate? And we have today, without going into detailed bios, some able representatives to speak to us. We first are going to have Chris Lewis, who's been at the Centre of Policing in Ontario for a number of years, and is going to describe the important work of the police in not only law enforcement, but involvement in security intelligence. Then we're going to have Steve Day talk to us about critical issues relating to the Canadian military, and particularly the role of first responders in both the domestic context and in terms of response internationally. And then finally we're going to have Carmine Marcello, who's going to talk, I suspect, about critical infrastructure, which will be vitally important to a number of you in this room in terms of protecting that against the terrorist threat. So, not to use any more of this valuable time on this important day, I'm going to call in Chris Lewis.
Well, good morning, everyone. Pleasure for me to be here again at the RCMI. Probably the first time I've ever stood up here without a drink sitting at my table, but I'm going to enjoy it just the same.
We can fix that. This afternoon.
Crown Royal is my favorite, just in case. Who is the current enemy? Somebody said that, it might have been Alan, one of our colleagues that spoke first said that. And what's really interesting, and how this has really evolved for me from the terrorism perspective is, we all, at one time when there was any conflict involving Canada as a country, it was in a land far away. It was in Korea, it was in Germany, it was in France, it was in places an ocean away from us. And it involved an enemy that wore a very distinctive uniform, wore a distinctive helmet, spoke a specific language. So we knew who the enemy was, and it was there, it wasn't here. That's all changed over the last several years, because who is the enemy now? The enemy may be the kid that grew up next door to you, that has become radicalized for a variety of reasons. It may be someone who comes to Canada for no other reason than to do Canada harm. They might be here for years and years before that occurs. It may well be your colleague in the next office, as we see in the United States, where somebody comes into work one day and before you know it, there's a whole bunch of people dead. So the world has really changed in terms of identifying the enemy. It's also changed some thoughts too in terms of when it comes to organized crime and some other threats we face in the policing world over the years. The challenges are always immense. The intelligence gathering, the investigation, the subsequent apprehension, and were all complicated issues for us, but we could quite often arrest our way out of a lot of these things. We're not going to arrest our way out of the current threat when it comes to terrorism. Now, I said to my wife that I was speaking at something, are we prepared? My wife's a senior officer with the OPP. In fact, she's in charge of all tactical operations right now, including aviation and tactical teams and K-9 units. I say anything that crawls, bites, swims, and craps on the ground, she's in charge of. But I said, it's are we ready? Are we prepared? Was the topic of the day. And she said, just say no and run away from the mic screaming. And although I certainly agree with a lot of things my friend Alan Ball said, I don't think it's quite as bad as Alan portrays. But I don't disagree with much of what he said. I think that we are currently better prepared from an intelligence gathering, analysis, dissemination, investigation perspective than we ever have been in the past. Is it perfect? Without a doubt it's not. I know there's colleagues in the room here, former CSIS, current CSIS, and OPP officers that know a hell of a lot more about the security intelligence game than I do. But from what I have seen, based on the fact that there was a time that none of those agencies talked, very seldom, unless it was for personal relationships between agencies. I knew that guy and he knew her, and somehow or another we would exchange information. It didn't happen near as much because really political jealousies and interagency issues. On the CSIS front, as CSIS evolved in the 80s and became the organization it is today, their hands were tied for years as to what they could tell us and what they couldn't. It was no fault of the officers involved. The province and the feds, some of the issues between law enforcement agencies, municipalities that were afraid the OPP was going to take them over if they told us anything, and on and on. It created all kinds of issues. We're way past that now. We have intelligence groups that are linked through intelligence databases, regular meetings, discussions non-stop. We have eyes and ears out there within uniformed law enforcement contingents that we never had at one time, because it was all about secret squirrel stuff. And our intelligence within the OPP, you never heard from them, you sent them stuff, you never heard anything back, and we're talking 30 years ago. They were secret squirrels. We didn't know what the heck they did. They filled file cabinets full of stuff, but not necessarily cell blocks. So there wasn't a lot of interaction. They did not rely so much on the uniforms on the road that knew their communities, knew the people in the communities, developed effective relationships, received tips and intelligence information, not on terrorism at that time, obviously, but certainly they weren't counted on. That's changed tremendously. Our intelligence, our provincial anti-terrorism section, they reach out constantly with bulletins and information to the uniformed folks and encourage that flow of information back. That's put us in a way better perspective. The RCMP formed their Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams, INSET. The OPP formed Provincial Anti-Terrorism Section. All the major departments are part of those groups. They're together, they're joined at the hip, they're constantly gathering information, disseminating it, and determining next steps in terms of investigations. The Toronto 18 investigation, which piles and piles of agencies were involved in, it was headquartered out of our building in Aurelia for the most part, for a variety of physical location reasons. But that was a classic example of information that started out small and grew and grew. It was properly investigated, and without a doubt, as the former CSIS colleague spoke here earlier, it came pretty close. And without a doubt, people were going to die, but it didn't. And that, I mean, that's a success story. There's been many, many others. But at the same time, is someone like B-Bo out there right now brewing that maybe is on the radar somewhere as being odd, or maybe ticked off because he didn't get his passport. Are they brewing, and are they going to do something and kill somebody at some point? Sadly, that will happen. But we prevented so much in this country, and we will continue to. At the same time, could it be better? Without a doubt. But where is that money going to come from? Because in policing, and Steve and I were talking a minute ago, the military, as he said, they train to get ready for some ungodly thing that's happening somewhere in the world. But in policing, you're going to do so much of that because you're doing your thing day in and day out, trying to keep communities safe. You're going to car crashes, and you're investigating domestic assaults and robberies, and all wonderful skills that help you to investigate bigger and better things. But at the same time, if you're going to form another unit of hundreds of people to properly be engaged in security intelligence or preparing to respond to terrorist acts, those bodies are coming from somewhere. And that means something has to stop. The terror government's not going to throw another few $100 million at the OPP. At one point we were looking at, when I was commissioner, cutting our anti-terrorism unit totally, taking it right off the board. and saying, okay, RCMP and CSIS, good luck with national security. We'll be there to help with surveillance, help with investigations, but we just don't have the capacity to do the intelligence piece. That changed greatly. Thankfully, we didn't have to do it because we didn't lose the $100 million out of our budget that the Liberals were going to take from us at one point. And that happens with every government. I'm not pointing fingers at any political stripe. Every government, and I worked for them all, at some point said, hey, find $100 million. So you can't necessarily be all things to all people. But we are totally joined at the hip, federally, provincially, and municipally. Are things going to fall through the cracks? Without a doubt they are, so it could be better. On the federal perspective, the RCMP are tied to Canada Border Service Agency, to CSIS, to intelligence networks and agencies that all of those groups are tied to around the world, particularly in the CSIS front when it comes to national security. Municipal departments working together, working with the OPP, shared intelligence databases and organized crime fronts through federal and provincial entities like Criminal Intelligence Service Ontario, and more. That is happening in a fantastic way. I don't disagree with Al on that. It could be more, but once again, how is that going to change? We're just not going to have a bunch of money that we can suddenly do that with. It's also bigger than policing. It's bigger than federal agencies. It's social services agencies, educators, communities, and educating people around the whole radicalization piece to prevent those budding BBOs that are out there ticked off with a lever action rifle and mad they didn't get a passport, and they're going to go in and be a threat to our parliament, our prime minister and government. So preventing all of that, there's an intelligence piece too. But once again, people are going to slip through the cracks because that is the reality of the current threat. When it comes to anticipated events, like Y2K, which Chris Corrigan mentioned at the beginning, and he and I first met, that was for the first time probably we anticipated something was going to happen on a real broad scale. It was bigger than intelligence. It was all kinds of analysis and industry and everybody pulling their heads together trying to figure out how Y2K was going to impact us. And in that case, we put a team together and we worked through it. You normally don't get all that notice on big events. If a storm hits, a tornado or whatever it might be, you have to rely on emergency planning that has occurred prior to the event, mitigation strategies, recovery strategies, and that was something we weren't good at in policing. Y2K was the first time in policing we ever planned around an emergency. We used to throw in an incident commander or two that had some leadership strength and experience. We threw 1,000 people at it. We pulled a rabbit out of a hat and saved the community from a flood or a fire or whatever it might be. That was wrong that we did it that way, but that's the way we did it. So Y2K taught us more. 9/11 taught us more. The ice storm in 1998 taught us huge because we were not prepared for that. And if another one happens again, we'll be way better prepared, but we're not necessarily going to have the ability to have gasoline and generators and all that everywhere because once again, all that costs money. This past week I was in Memphis and I heard the FBI Director, Comey, excellent speaker, he's talked about terrorism. So when you think about what he said, and I'll read it to you, and how that affects us in terms of the intelligence gathering, analysis, and subsequent investigation, trying to prevent things from occurring before they do, and then being properly prepared to react when they do happen, and they will. He said this, he said, terrorism 2 years ago was, all we thought about was Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda. He said, Al-Qaeda targeted specific structures in specific locations and aircraft largely. Certain cities were a higher threat level, and then within those cities there were certain monuments or buildings like the World Trade Center that were significant targets for them. And they did what they did, and still continue to. He said ISIS changed the model to come to us and fight, or stay home and kill a bunch of people. He said that was a significant change. He calls it the come or kill strategy. Come to us and kill, stay home and kill. We don't care, just kill. He says they proactively and effectively use social media 24/7 to spread the come or kill message. That's changed hugely for us too. the monitoring of the social media, developing effective social media strategies to try and bring reality to the messaging. Come on over to Syria and join the most wonderful life. When it's all said and done, you'll have 72 virgins. Well, you know what? They're going to be living in a cave, living on the ground, getting shot at, watching all your buddies die. That isn't necessarily communicated very well by ISIS. So having effective communication strategies around that, monitoring the internet from an intelligence perspective, and also having public strategies and communication strategies within schools and other places is a big part of the prevention piece as well. And then he talks about the third prong, which is come to us, kill, and then go home and be better killers. The returning people from Syria and whatnot. He said they're way more committed and way more trained and able to kill in a much more effective way. He talked about Twitter crowdfunding terrorism. It's their biggest recruitment arm, and that's how they're going to gather the groups and the folks to do it. But then he said something very interesting. He said the FBI caseload is actually decreasing right now when it comes to the radicalization piece. That surprised me, but he said they don't know why that is. They don't know if it's a case that police and educators and intelligence agencies and others have been doing a good job and somehow or another managed to deter people from engaging in that activity. He says it's too soon to tell, but he's being very hopeful that that's actually what has occurred. He talked as well about relationships between agencies in terms of the sharing piece, which I am seeing in Canada, thankfully, to a much higher level than we once did, as I said. But he said that they're trying to change relationships between agencies there to make them so strong and so good as a federal agency, working with municipal, local law enforcement, etc., and states, to make them so good that people will forget there was ever bad relationships. So that will become a thing of the past. And I think that needs to be our continued goal here in Canada as well. Even though we're light years ahead of where we were, we need to continue that. And I know the folks for CSIS and others that are in this room today are very committed to that. And we thank them for that. One more thing. I'll turn it over to somebody else. Just bear with me if you don't mind, please. On the resource front, I talked to the Commissioner of the RCMP within a few months of the attacks in Ottawa and in Quebec, where two military officers were killed. At that time, he had over 600 people from drug investigations and organized crime cases assigned to nothing but do surveillance on targets that were suspected of being radicalized. How do you sustain that? How do you sustain an organization that a big chunk of their resources are to fight drugs and organized crime in this country, subsequently not having the people to do that? Something's got to give there. So on the resource front, once again, unless the Mounties get millions of bucks, and so does the OPP in Toronto, everybody else, we're just not going to be able to do it all. So, in a nutshell, none of that is wonderful news, but I do say it's much better than some would say, thankfully. I truly believe that, or I wouldn't say it. Am I being fooled? Yeah, sometime down the road something will happen, you say, Lewis was wrong again. But I am pretty confident that we're not in so bad a shape right now. So that's it for me. Thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to somebody else.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, Chris, thank you very much for the invite here today. It's an absolutely beautiful facility, and I know there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes to put this conference on, so I think just on behalf of everybody, thank you for the invite today. What I'd like to do is, when Chris called me initially in January to invite me to participate in the panel today, he asked me what I might wish to speak on. And we bandied back and forth about what those topics might be. We kind of focused on meshing the first responders as a title. And I want to drill into that, because what I was concerned after we had agreed on the title, I said, okay, now I got to actually kind of scope this problem down, because this is a significant challenge to work through. So I thought through it, I scoped it back, and what I want to set in context right off the bat. If you look at the Canadian national security context, and if you look at Canada's national counterterrorism strategy, there's actually 4 different pillars to that. There's the prevent, the detect, deny, and respond. Prevent, detect, and deny clearly are the remits of the law enforcement. Border Security, CSIS, and those other agencies. That respond pillar on the far right is where I want to focus my comments on. So as you listen to what I'm saying today, I'm thinking through the respond, and I'm thinking through it as the force of last resort, the Joint Task Force 2, coming in to resolve a situation in the national interest that could not be resolved without calling in JTF2. So I'm not necessarily a cynic, I'm not necessarily a pessimistic person, but I do take issue with a couple of the comments that were made earlier this morning, and I'm hoping we can have an informed dialogue about this. And I would respectfully offer as a response to the question, are we prepared, meshing the first responders, it depends. And I say it depends because it very much depends on your point of view. And that's not a waffle, and I want to work through that so that you guys we can have a shared dialogue and understanding. So before I explain that response in detail, I must explain the context that I'm looking at that question through, because if we have a shared context, then we can have an exchange of ideas. If we're not on the same page, it's just me on send, you on receive, and maybe the thoughts are passing each other. So to set my lens for you, I want you to think through this shared framework. I am looking at this through the national level, not the provincial level necessarily, not the municipal level, not the corporate level. My experiential base is at the national level. And as I said, as a CT responder. So, who am I? What are my formative events over 20 years that have led me to be a crisis response practitioner, and why do I hold the positions that I do? So, by design, I'm a mechanical engineer by schooling. So that should give you a little bit of insight about who I am. I'm an Army Combat Engineer Officer for the first half of my career. So what does that mean? I'm used to pulling my armored and infantry brethren fat out of the fryer because I had a great idea that just didn't happen at each hour. And the second half of my career, I'm a SOF, Special Operations Assaulter Officer. I look at problems and go, okay, we've got a situation, how are we going to resolve that? The so what from those things are, I'm analytical by nature, and I try to understand the risk. Because without understanding the risk, we can't have a solution that's not tactically relevant, but strategically out of balance with the politicians, the institution, or those tactical practitioners. So for over 20 years, I've been a practitioner and student of contingency planning and crisis response activities across a broad range of operations. I've been fortunate to have been part of some very interesting events. I have a breadth of experience across that operations spectrum, but I've also got a bit of a depth of experience at the technical and tactical level, a frontline responder, if you will, all the way through the system, all the way through the ecosystem, up to the political level. Having sat around some tables with the big boys and big girls where we wrestled with some very difficult national security challenges. So just a few examples. So the environment that I was working in. Some of these were unilateral Canadian operations. Some were coalition-based. Some were NATO. Bilats with the CAN-US, which is always an interesting space to be in. Some with the UN. And then, obviously, a number of things in the interagency space. I'm going to come back to the interagency comment later on in this. Other things I've done in the operations space, I've conducted 2 domestic response humanitarian operations, 2 international humanitarian response, 2 NEOs, so non-evacuation or non-combatant evacuation operations that Canada ran in the mid-2000s, 1 UN Chapter 7, and since 9/11, I've been involved in almost every national security event. Since 2000, I've been involved in almost every national security event. We talk about Toronto 18, we talk about GH-G20s, talk about the Olympics, etc. I've either been in there as the ground floor practitioner, as a planner, or sitting around the table where we're trying to wrestle with these ill-defined and wicked national security problems. So I tell you this for one reason. It's not to say I've been there, done that, and I have all the answers. I do not pretend for one moment to have all the answers. I say that what I've learned from that is that in every instance, irrespective of the situation that we were in, irrespective of the institutions, the process, the challenges, I saw dedicated professionals, volunteers, contractors, academics, whoever were brought around the table, trying to resolve these wicked challenges, these wicked national security issues. I saw great Canadians doing the best they can in an ill-structured national security architecture. And I want to come back to that. So, as I mentioned, the people are at the center of everything that we're trying to do on the national security side of the house. But it requires 2 other things. It requires leadership, and it requires a known process. And this is actually the nub of our national security challenges as far as I'm concerned. And I came to realize that we've got a bunch of great people, And me being somewhat lazy as an individual, kind of trying to find the easiest way to get the job done, I would often ask, why are we working so hard? To what end? And at what risk? What are we trying to achieve? And so this came up time and time again over my career. So it leads me to that leadership question, that process question, that national architects question. And so that's why I come back to it depends. Are we prepared? Well, it does depend. Are we trying to resolve the national hostage rescue operation halfway around the globe? Are we trying to respond to a brownout in 2003? The spectrum of emergency responsive is vast. And so it depends on how we want to respond to those things, because you can't respond to everything, because as Chris has mentioned, there is not enough resources in the Canadian national security apparatus to be prepared for everything. So we need to prioritize those things that are likely and those things that have high impact. So working through this again, in my estimation, there are a number of factors that drive the "it depends" answer. But preeminent, in my experience, is having the right decision makers and leaders define what success looks like at each level. And not only that, what type of risk are we willing, and to what degree are we willing to accept that risk. And so regardless of whether you're at the political level, the institutional corporate level, the tactical level, those leaders need to define the criteria for success, so those first responders, those people on the front line know what they're working towards, and we need to be able to articulate the risk that at the various levels we are willing to assume. We can do those two things. There's nobody in this room, there's nobody in this country that cannot resolve the most challenging of problems. But if it's not defined correctly, we have a bunch of great folks doing a bunch of great things, but maybe we're not harmonized and synchronized. So, I'd like to look a little bit at leadership in the organization, because as I said off the top, this is kind of the root cause of where most of our emergency challenges reside. So, our democratic system is designed to elect self-selected leaders, if you will, self-selected candidates at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. The vast majority of which have zero knowledge, training, or experience in responding to crisis of any stripe. These are self-selected politicians who are there to be a politician, who are to lead us. That is our system. So we need to understand that system that we're led by. You then place these politicians inside, who for the most part are great Canadians. So please don't misunderstand that comment. They just don't have the experiential knowledge or training experience to be able to work in the crucible of a national security event. We then place them inside an organizations that are largely built in the post-World War II 20th century framework. And Chris alluded to it as well as we work through the 90s into the 2000s. We do not have an agile national security architecture that is prepared for the 21st century threats. And I take, Andy, your point about being on the defense constantly. I agree, we are constantly on the defense. And if you're on the defense, you can't win the war, you can't win the game. You've got to, at some point, get on the offense. And our system is set up to be defensive right now. We then compound that problem with a lack of interagency training, cooperation, and lexicon. And lastly, as Chris alluded to just recently, we have a challenge sometimes investing in priority areas. We've got finite resources in this country. Where are we going to apply those finite resources to which problem? And when the goalpost shifts, when the goalposts shift, it's very hard for the apparatus to shift and remain agile. And we have a hard time, so I come back to, you've got a political leadership, we live in a democracy that doesn't always understand the challenges. So going back to Alan's, your point, we can respond after the fact, because all of a sudden there's a focus, there's money and resources, but pre-event, it is very difficult to move those goalposts. So, what does this mean? It means in the moment of crisis, when something unfortunately happens and goes bad, we've got an ad hoc team brought together that is largely personality driven, and it leads to sub-optimized responses. I want to say that again. In the moment of crisis, on the response side of the pillars, we've got an ad hoc team pulled together. Notwithstanding the success of INSET, which is a great example of interagency work working together, largely personality driven because we don't have mature processes to be able to say, let's get away from the personalities and work through a process, leading to sub-optimized responses. Up to today, that's actually been okay. Up to today, we've been lucky that the threat vectors on the terrorism side have been carried out by individuals and actors that have mental illness, maybe are not the smartest, but when we come against a multi-pronged, smart adversary, our system is simply not built to respond to simultaneous attacks across multiple threat vectors. So, in conclusion, when I state that the answer is it depends, well, it really depends on the severity of the challenge on the day that we're trying to confront. It depends on the time available to start putting the response team, the mechanism in place. And it depends on the resources at hand. We live in a massive country. When you look at Canada, we live in an absolutely massive country. And when you do not resource that country to all the resources required to secure it, it takes time and time to close the space between an event in Vancouver, Toronto, or Halifax. There are only ever so many resources to respond to a national crisis. And then lastly, we have not had success defined from those various levels. What is deemed politically successful and political risk is very, very different from what institutional or corporate success and risk looks like, and is very different from what tactical success and risk looks like. And I'll tell you, as a frontline officer, or having dealt with many frontline officers, the men and women who need to resolve the challenge, their perspective on risk, their perspective on success is very different from the politicians. So, in sum, are we prepared? It is very hard to prove a negative. And Canada to date has managed the challenge to this point, because we have managed the challenges. We have had numerous threat vectors that have been dealt with. Have we managed this to the point that we have managed this to the point due to the inherent talents and dedication of individuals working inside an architecture that is somewhat out of date, and we are trying to move that architecture forward. Some optimized, but they're getting the jobs done. So not because we have necessarily written and shared plans that are trained and executed and exercised for on the day so we can actually do this quickly. It's because these individual Canadians step up, often, swing above their weight, so to speak, and get the job done. So can we do better? We absolutely can do better. Should we do better? Yes, we should. But let's put these challenges in perspective, and I'm sure as all of us as taxpayers are not necessarily committed to having billions of dollars potentially misallocated within our very finite national security architectures. Thank you very much.
Good.
Like I said, I don't fit the crowd. And he goes, no, you do. You have to worry about keeping the lights on, and everybody in this room uses that statement, keeping the lights on, to mean exactly the same thing, only from within their own specific perspective. And I think the fact that everybody can relate to keeping the lights on as a concept speaks to perhaps the vulnerability of electricity as well. And when we talk threat vectors and all these other things, I'll leave it to you, but I'm going to tell a little bit of an electricity story. And I think that story is entirely relates to what we're talking about here. So what can I guarantee you on any given day in the province of Ontario? I can guarantee you there is someone sitting in the dark. End of story. It doesn't matter how much money you want to throw at that problem, that thing, which we will define as a bad thing, sitting in the dark, is a reality. So, are we safe? That's a good question. You posed it. What does safe actually look like? Does that mean the lights are on all the time? Does that mean every bad person has been caught if they're going to do something bad? I think we debate and we spend a lot of time on those sorts of questions, and we've defined the problem in a fashion that allows us to concede defeat in many cases. From an electricity perspective, I'm going to suggest that we know the lights go out, so what do we do about it? We design a culture, we design processes, we look at our risk assessments. We heard some of these comments earlier. We ask what if and we ask so what? And every time the lights go out, someone is looking at why did it happen, how do we do better? And I think it's the same sort of analogies that apply to the security questions. The difficulty sometimes is those questions are asked on the front page of the newspaper, or in Queen's Park, or in Ottawa, as opposed to in a room where we can have an intellectual discussion, debate, and land on a balanced answer. So from Hydro One's perspective, as a guy who started, been there almost 30 years, worked on planning the system, so I can tell you how the lights go out and when they'll go out. And then I spent part of my career in the operating center, which would tell you when the lights go out, what are we going to do about it? And then I had the pleasure of running an organization which is full of personalities, we just heard that comment, all kinds of processes, competing interests, debates and fights over money. How do you balance all of those things when the lights go out, you don't know whether it was the 1998 ice storm, the flood we had in Toronto a couple of years ago, remember that one? There was all kinds of stuff behind the scenes on the G20 and Y2K, all kinds of things can impact the lights going out. And if they're within my fence, Hydro One's fence, don't worry about it, is sort of my answer. Why? Because every time something happens, we sit there, we look at it, what went wrong, what could we have done better, what do I need to change, and I'll prioritize, and I'll make a call, and sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I get it wrong. But we're always improving, and we've got a culture of continuously learning, continuously improving. And some of the learnings that we have go between centralizing the decision or decentralizing the decision. In 1998, the ice storm hit, we didn't have a lot of tools. We didn't have ways of communicating. We didn't know how many customers were out. The storms that took place after that built infrastructure. We built infrastructure in order to respond to a point where if that same event happens today, it's not a big, massive, centralized activity. It's very much decentralized. The processes are in place. The systems are in place. We've learned how to deal with it. We can do the same with a flood. What we can't do today is respond to a cyber attack or a physical attack to the electrical system. And I know a lot of the discussion this morning has been around the shift from ISIS to, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS and what that means in terms of the target. And the target always seems to be people and fear. But what worries me is when the electrical system becomes the target. Because if everyone's sitting in the dark and it was lightning, weather, all the rest, we'll get it back. And someone might have to answer in an inquiry, and we might be on CNN explaining when the lights are coming back on. But the public generally will still have a trust. You can have Katrina, you can have Superstorm Sandy, and you can explain to the public that these were bad things, we're learning from them, we'll do better. But if it's a cyber attack, where the answer is, I have no clue, or a physical attack where we're arguing and debating whether a hydro worker is considered a frontline responder and should be allowed past that barrier by someone in either the military or the police. And if we haven't discussed those things up front and haven't debated them, we're going to be figuring them out on the fly. And that's where a lot of problems take place. So the things that scare me today, I'm going to put into a couple of categories. You've used the word lone wolf. I'm going to twist it a little bit. A lone wolf, but who happens to be a disgruntled employee. So it's the 22-year-old, third-year electrical engineering student who happened to be smart enough to figure out that all I need is piano wire and one bullet, and I can take down the entire grid. And I'm disgruntled. Now, layer that on with maybe a little bit of sophistication and have 3 of those people and put in an active shooter inside of a control room. And then call up our friends at the OPP or the military and say, we got to figure this thing out. Well, what is it we're figuring out? There's too many moving parts. When I started in this racket, and I would go down to the US, and I'd be sitting in rooms with a lot of folks from Homeland Security, I remember once making the very naive comment along the lines of, isn't that your job to keep us safe? And the answer was, well, how are we supposed to keep you safe? We don't even know what it is you do. And some very basic things came out of some of those early meetings. For example, there are probably the need for standards within a power system to define what is inside the box and what is outside the box. So I know what I have to do better, and you know what you have to do better. And then we need to talk about what happens when someone penetrates or tries to penetrate those multiple vectors. The one that was the biggest learning for me was the power system was built by a bunch of very smart, capable men and women who, as time progressed, everybody had a laptop. And every one of those laptops had the backdoor password to a relay somewhere out in the system. And anybody could access that from their basement. And no one actually kept track of all those passwords, or all those ports, or what version of software was out there. And you quickly realized that this was a threat. This was a major threat. And as you started to learn a little bit more about cybersecurity and cyber attacks, you started to realize we needed standards. We need to close some of those doors. We need to put protocols in place to control those things. We need to build a culture within an organization that says, this stuff is important. You know what? You wouldn't leave your front door unlocked. Don't leave the ports to your system open to attack. And part of the difficulty is saying things like that are viewed as perhaps embarrassing. But until everybody starts to say, you know what, this is the current practice, this isn't right, we need new standards, we need to put them into place, we need to audit against those standards. And once we have done that, we as an industry are okay. Then we can sit down with our friends in the military and in intelligence community and say, what's your role? When do we call you? What do you want to see happening on our system where you want us to let you know? And we start putting in information sharing protocols in place so that the information from our perspective is, oh, just some kids trying to hack our system. Well, that would be very valuable information for military and intelligence people to know what's happening because you have greater information. But if I'm just sitting on it, not sharing, not talking, again, another opportunity for things to fall apart. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to leave you with one story. And this is what I'm going to suggest highlights a positive in the relationship between industry and the community at large in terms of trying to do the right thing for keeping us all safe. And it was a horrible event. We're all aware, it's been referenced earlier today, the attack in Ottawa. I'm sitting in a meeting with a lot of industry colleagues, and it was one of these meetings, it was quite boring. So what do people do when they're bored? They pull out their phone and they look at what's happening on the global news feed or the Globe and Mail. And oh my God, Ottawa is under attack. I mean, it's literally coming across. And within 2 minutes of that, I receive an email from then the head of our security and control room people, because Public Safety Canada took this event, which turns out to be an active shooter event, translates that piece of information into actionable threat information that someone in a control room in a different city whose job is to keep the lights on could actually do something about it. So what did we do? We basically went into quiet mode and we're watching and we're waiting because we don't know what's going to happen next. And everybody in the field, you know, have 5,000 eyes in the system with radios saying, is there anything happening that we should be aware of? Let's feed that back, and we have a protocol for communicating. So, don't know how it could have turned out, but I can tell you that would have never happened 3 years ago, let alone in 9/11. So to me, those are some of the positive changes that have been occurring. There's a ton more to do. And I would suggest, from an infrastructure perspective, there are a lot of vectors that intersect. Transportation, telecommunications, oil, gas, financial, and electricity. Any one of those will impact the other. And until we talk, exercise those sorts of systems, we really won't know what's going to happen, and we'll be left with the, let's just react well when it happens. So with that, I'm going to leave it as very optimistic because we have been learning.
Yes, I'm currently serving as voluntary chair of the RCMP Foundation. And we raise funds to support youth at risk programs that involve RCMP members. And the question that I have is, are there countries in the world that are really a shining example of engaging citizens in helping to prevent, whether it be terrorist activities or other types of security crisis that we can learn from, given the limited resources that are available to to policing and to military, and so are there countries that we can learn from that actively engage their citizens in helping to prevent this kind of security crisis?
Chris?
Thanks for the question, Bill. I'm not aware of any countries that specifically are shining examples of that. But what I will say from the Canadian perspective, the relationships between the police and the community are much more trusting. There's better communication, there are much more open relationships, a lot more emphasis spent on community relations, and particularly around youth by police departments, that I think that lends it ourselves to actually being more effective than other countries. When you look at what's going on in the United States right now, the kind of, policing's got a real public image problem. We have some of that in Canada that came from the US experience, some of it because of things that have happened here too. But generally speaking, I think that if the police have a great relationship with the public, people are going to come forward. They're going to tell you things, they're going to report things that they won't if in fact they don't trust the police. I was in Trinidad a couple of years ago dealing with the Trinidad police on a promotional process. Actually, I sat on a panel and I heard from their senior officers that the public doesn't trust the police. They think they're all corrupt. Their theory is if you call them, they won't come, and if they do, they're going to rip you off anyway. We don't have that in Canada. It doesn't matter what police service in Ontario that you name, there's always the odd bad day, but generally speaking, the relationships are so strong that I think that sort of thing just happens through osmosis, I guess. It's a good question, and that's so key. You tell people if you see something, say something. If they don't trust you, they're not going to say something. But we've come past that in Canada to a large degree.
Thank you very much. Other questions? No, I have one as a public educator, teaching in a couple of universities. The security threats and national security is the subject I teach. I can tell you among young people that I encounter at Ryerson and at York University, there is a thirst for more knowledge about our system, not in any perverse way, but they want to know how the system operates. They want to know what CSIS is. Never heard of CSEC, never heard of CBSA except when they go through the airport and they call him the customs guy. Don't understand the relationship between the RCMP and the OPP and why Ontario has its own police force and Alberta doesn't, and those sorts of simple questions. But there is a general public thirst for knowledge among younger people about our system, not to in any way advantage themselves, but to operate in a free and democratic society. So I would urge people who are now in a position of being recently retired and not having institutional constraints on them to go out and talk to universities and to the community groups who have a genuine interest in this, and to not be afraid to appear on television. I wish this sort of proceeding could be available to community colleges and to university courses that might be of interest. And I can tell you there is this thirst for knowledge, and that's only for the better in terms of our preservation of our democratic values in society and understanding what these institutions do, how they are important, how they have successes, how they have failures, and where Canada stacks up against our friends, the Americans, the UK, and Australia and New Zealand and that sort of thing. So I'm making my little pitch as an educator. Yes, sir.
Thank you to the panel. My name's Sandy Boucher. We've heard a lot about resources. I'm sure we all understand that as taxpayers, government, private sector resources impact all of this. And I got to wondering, if in a perfect world you did have more resources, if someone said, you know what, you're right, everything you people have been saying in the room today, we need to do something. I wonder if the panel would like to speak to, where do you think we should be putting those resources? I'd be quite interested to hear the answer to that.
Thank you. This is a question that's near and dear to my heart. So I will absolutely jump on this one. It comes to, when you look at Canada and the national security apparatus that we have got significant resource pressures because the country is so large. But it goes back to my point I was making about a 20th century viewpoint. When you look in Ottawa, when you get inside the Ottawa bubble, that architecture, notwithstanding the tremendous change that Prime Minister Martin put in place in 2004, where we built ITAC and we did a number of things at the grand strategic level of the country, a bunch of good architecture got put in place at that level. But we've got a national security advisor that doesn't necessarily have the legislative or regulatory remit to actually task departments to get on with solving some solutions. So when we get into this resource-constrained environment, every department, and I will use D&D as an example, goes back and tries to protect core capabilities. So here we have right now a defense review underway in Ottawa, lacking a foreign policy review, lacking a public safety review, lacking a framework called a national security strategy that nests all this together. So D&D is charging out to come up with their defense policy review without being able to hang the review inside a national security strategy. So what happens? Army, Navy, Air Force, being the big players in D&D, and I'm using D&D as a perfect example, they don't have the resources to refit aircraft, ships, vehicles, and all that, so it becomes a rice bowl problem. And you cannot resolve it when everybody believes their core competency was what must be protected. So if we take it out of the 20th century threat and bring it to the 21st century threat environment, there's probably more than enough resources to resource the national security apparatus if we would get away from D&D worrying about planes, boats, and ships and vehicles, and looking at the cellular nature, whether it be cyber or whether it be threat vectors coming from lone wolves, and focused our resources on the threat vectors of today. Not getting rid of the big national defense architecture because you need it for mobilization, but we are not living in a nation state on nation state world. We are living in a cellular world, which means we need to become cellular.
Question, sir.
Mr. Lewis and Mr. Ellis both mentioned young radicalized people going to the Middle East, and that a number of them come back either to cause further harm and be more prepared and more knowledgeable in how to do that, but surely there are some other people who come back thoroughly disenchanted and disgusted with what they've seen, and I'm wondering if we use those resources as, obviously I'm sure we do use them as intelligence, but do we also use them as public relations in order to influence other young people not to become radicalized. Certainly I don't think I've ever seen any kind of newspaper or magazine article talking about some young kid that's come back and has some pretty rotten stories to tell about it.
Chris?
Excellent question, sir. I wish I had an excellent answer. I'm not aware of any either. It makes total sense. I know from an intelligence perspective, there would be some people talking to people, which just wouldn't be, publicly shared or on television. I know one mother from Western Canada whose son became radicalized, and she lectures, travels around now. Her son was killed in Syria, I believe. And she lectures on what she saw as a mother, what she didn't react to and should have. So a very good, strong learning example. She's been on television programs and spoke all over Canada. So other than the security perspective and the debriefing and the informant perspective, I'm not aware of any at all, and maybe others in this room are potentially our CSIS
I think we've got to mention in that context fear of retribution is a deterrent to anybody wanting to become a hero. Yes?
I guess I got preempted because I got the mic. I know, Steve, you were talking about prevent, detect, reply, and respond. And I know when we, in disaster emergency management, that discipline, there's the 4 or 5 pillars of emergency management: mitigate, respond, and recover. But pretty much every discipline, and then you add on business continuity, which has sort of DRI principles and practices, everybody has their own methodology. Everybody has their own lexicon. As a matter of fact, it's just similar enough to confuse everyone. And with all of this giant plethora of people all together, I'd like to ask the panel, how do they foresee all of these groups coming together, considering that many of them aren't even represented in this room? It's just interesting that every one of these groups I go to will talk about breaking down silos and so on, but from what I can see, there's just a huge number of groups, and they're not working together, and they're not really coming up with integrated solutions.
I'm going to try an industry example. Within the electrical industry in North America, it's a north-south grid. This concept of Canada-US does not exist to electrical engineers. The difficulty is anytime something happens on the power system, it crosses international boundaries. And a lot of the discussion around reliability and resiliency has now centered on either cyber attacks from nation states or the active shooter example. And there's been enough examples in North America of both type instances where the industry is taking it very seriously. They put in standards, and they run every 2 years an exercise called GridX, and now they're on to cycle 3. So GridX 3 just took place in North America. Just to give you a sense of what's involved. Pretty well every major utility, every major law enforcement on both sides of the border in a room running through a 3-day exercise of what if. And the what if scenarios that have been tried are things that would have coordinated cyber and physical attacks spread out over months. And the whole point of it is the lessons learned. And a lot of the lessons learned are who needs to talk to who on what side of the border, and then you quickly realize there are legislative roadblocks. We can't share that information across the Canada-US border, but the Canadian-US military can share. So we're in a room where the industry sides don't know what's going on, but the military side do. How do we resolve those issues? They're simple things, logistics. Imagine a scenario where you blow up transformers or shoot transformers. These things take 10 months to a year to get a new unit, and you have to get them from Korea. How do we share the resources we have in North America amongst ourselves? How do you move that piece of equipment when you don't have the actual capability to transport it across the country. So in some of those scenarios, discussions like, what do we need to put in place to be able to move resources on a mass scale on a continental basis? What do we need to have in place from coordination with the Department of Transport to allow the transportation of transformers? The biggest lesson learned that came out of the last event was, if a server is infected, who is capable of ripping that server out, replacing it, keeping the lights on, and then taking that server and actually putting it into one of the national labs, have it torn apart? And the concept of an industry and government SWAT team, for lack of a better word, who have the capability to respond to those sorts of events, are things that have come out of the discussion. The reality is, we don't even know the answer, but at least now we have another set of questions we need to work towards.
Thanks, Carmen. Gentleman at the back has been waiting patiently. Your turn.
Hi, gents. I'm a part of an organization that's large and green and sees every problem as a nail. However, slung some sandbags in Winnipeg, fixed some hydro poles in 1998, so there's a nexus there. One of the challenges that we run into is, we have a current challenge when you go to the right of the event, is that you have both too much information and a dearth of information. So I see the mobilization of the 5,000 power workers with radios, excellent, plus all the OPP officers out there, excellent, plus concerned citizens, but all of a sudden, your command and control apparatus is flooded. How best do we harness that and filter the signal-to-noise ratio so that measurable information and actionable information can be applied prior to the bang happening to preempt it? And are we there? And what do we have to do from a regulatory, governance, communications framework of any kind to make sure that we're best exploiting all this flood of data and information we have access to? Thank you.
I'll try and start this one and then hand it off. So it goes back to my comment that I was making about Paul Martin's government in 2004 fixing at the national level the public safety apparatus, creating for the first time a national security advisor, the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, and fixing at the national level those intelligence feeds and then turning that into analysis. The machine breaks down though from the national level down to the grassroots level where the frontline officers are operating and seeing what's going on, because we do not have standards, regulatory mechanisms, legislation in place saying this is how nationally we will respond to various crises. So what ends up happening is it's ad hoc. It's ad hoc on the day, and you do get an information overload, and you then can't sift out of all that information where the nuggets are. So we've got it set at the national level right now. Could it be better? Absolutely. We know the frontline officers, operatives, intelligence analysts are doing brilliant work. But from the tactical level, technical level, you use the example of the 5,000 hydro workers out in the space, up to the national level, that system does not exist. We've never built in the architecture to fuse it at the operational level, if you will.
Questions, further questions?
Can I just add to that?
Oh, go ahead.
If I can just quickly add to that, and I don't disagree with what you're saying at all in the question. However, what I saw during the last few years on the First Nations protest front in this country showed everybody kind of melding together with the same approach. The intelligence sharing and all of that was really happening well. But we actually had meetings with all the chiefs in Ontario. We had meetings nationally with chiefs across Canada to make sure we're all on the same page. We all wanted to be comforted knowing that our intelligence people were talking, because we're being told that, but we wanted to hear that across the board. But the approach in terms of the way how aggressively they would approach arrests or a protest in New Brunswick as the sun rose across Canada, how it happened in Quebec, how it happened in Ontario, how it happened in BC, had to be very much the same. We had to be very united on the process by which we were going to handle that, and whether the public all agreed with our approach or not, that's another issue. But we had to do it in a way that we weren't going to have the things go to hell in a handbasket. And it was a very scary time for us, because if they had killed somebody in a protest in New Brunswick, Quebec was going to have a much more violent approach, Ontario would be hell, and in BC, God forbid. So we've really seen that in a big way. Now, are we prepared for simultaneous tactical operations right across Canada all at once. That's as close as we've come, as opposed to, active shooters, explosions all going off at once. At some point our resources would be tapped, but I think we're much better prepared now, but I would like to see even more of that on that more violent front.
Thanks, Chris. That's very instructive. One more question?
Thank you. My name is Iradat Ahmed. My question is linked with the earlier question from that end. There is a de-radicalization center, probably somewhere in Montreal, Quebec, which was visited by Mr. Ban Ki-moon recently once he came here. Are there any efforts to duplicate that model elsewhere in the country at the Ontario level or at the federal level? And my second question is, there was a comment regarding awareness of the public policy leaders. Are there any efforts being put in to enhance that awareness level of the public and especially the leadership at various levels?
If I could just ask you to repeat the first part of the first question. You said there was a model somewhere.
There is a de-radicalization center in Quebec. This was visited by Mr. Ban Ki-moon once he came here a few months ago.
Well, I can speak to what's going on in Canada. There's not a de-radicalization center per se. The police agencies, social service agencies, educators, mosques all around this country are talking. The RCMP put a number of programs in place focusing on youth and trying to lure kids away from a radicalization mindset, much like they try to lure them away from the guns and gangs mindset, because they're finding the kids are similarly attracted to those lifestyles, guns and gangs versus radicalization in many cases. So there's a lot of linkages there. So there's a number of programs that the RCMP has led the charge on that have been disseminated right across the country through all the youth officers and the community services officers in those agencies. So everybody's firing on the same cylinders largely, and that's about as much as I can say about it. How it's all actually, where the rubber's hitting the road, I'm confident it's coming together, but are things going to slip through the cracks without a doubt?